frontal lobe, which is related to the production of speech. And the motor area drives our muscles to produce speech. Further support for biological pre-programming comes from Lenneberg, among others, who suggested that there may be critical periods for language learning. Evidence has come from studies of severely emotionally and physically neglected children who've been reared in some kind of isolation. When they're discovered, these children cannot speak, and they do seem to have problems in learning to speak later. A recent case in Great Britain described a 5-year-old girl who'd been left alone in a dark bedroom for up to 22 hours a day. She could only communicate by grunts and squeals when she came to school. However, in many of the reported cases, the children have acquired some language when subsequently brought up in a normal environment. To summarize the debate on language acquisition, Chomsky takes the view that we're born with a predisposition to learn language. Support comes from the fact that children all over the world learn in the same way, that we have specialized nerve cells for language processing, that deaf babies babble, babies who've been isolated during certain critical periods do not acquire normal language, and that language is essential for survival. Skinner takes the opposing view that babies learn from the environment, from hearing language around them, being encouraged by parents, and by imitating and observing others. The major problem with this view is that children produce unique language that they could not have heard before. The interactionist view suggests that all these factors combined with good health and nutrition assist the development of language.
In this stage, the child's thinking is dominated by what it sees rather than by logical principles. The key feature is egocentrism. Piaget considers pre-operational children to be irredeemably egocentric, in that although they are now well aware of self, as separate from the rest of the world, they're quite unable to take anyone else's point of view into consideration. Piaget claims that the child cannot see the point of view of another in a literal sense, in that the child will not understand that an object will be seen differently from another angle of view, and in the sense of being unable to understand that another person might feel or think differently to itself. A well-known demonstration of egocentrism by Piaget and Inhelder, reported in 1956, made use of the tabletop model of a Swiss mountain scene. After an opportunity to become familiar with the model, children were asked to choose a photograph from a selection which showed the view of the scene from the point of view of a doll which was placed at a different angle from the child. To get the task right, the child would have to take the doll's perspective into account. Each mountain was painted in a different colour and topped with either a house, a red cross, or snow for clarity. Only children of 8 years or over were able to consistently succeed at this task. 6-year-olds achieved some success, and 4-year-olds typically chose their own view. This would be a simple practical to run yourself if you have access to children of the right age and can build mountains. Alternatively, you could use the modern-day version, which we'll demonstrate later. At the beginning of the pre-operational stage, the child also has difficulty in dealing with tasks logically. For example, classifying things, putting things into a logical sequence or series, and understanding relations between categories, for example apples, and subcategories, for example red apples and green apples. A 4-year-old may be able to separate coloured pencils into yellow ones and green ones, or into big ones and little ones, but it's likely to find it much more difficult to take 2 dimensions into account so as to pick out all the big yellow ones or all the small green ones.
You can lie them down if you want to. Are there any more big green pencils? Oh, you found another one. Well, that's a good boy. You did that very well. Thank you very much.
Similarly, a child at the beginning of the pre-operational stage, at say 3 or 4, will have difficulty arranging items in order, such as longest to shortest, or tallest to smallest. A child up to 5, if shown a garage with yellow cars and blue cars, is likely to agree with you that the yellow ones are cars and the blue ones are cars. However, if then asked if all the yellow cars drive away, will there be any left, the child is quite likely to say that there won't be any left. Piaget believes that an incorrect answer reflects not merely confusion over verbal labels, but a deeper inability to consider more than one feature at a time. This concentration Piaget called centration. Until a child can decenter, he will be unable to classify in any logical way and will still be unable to, say, tell the difference between cats and dogs. Why? Because he only takes into account one attribute, that is, perhaps that they have 4 legs, and ignores the other differences. Having acquired this cognitive skill by 4 to 5 years old, the older pre-operational thinker still appears to have problems with classification. You can try this example yourself.
Are they all cars? Are there more blue cars or more red cars? Are there more blue cars or more cars?
Blue cars.
You may have had to think a second or two before answering that question, but according to Piaget, 6- and 7-year-olds find it very hard. He says the child is failing to understand the relationship between the whole class, that's cars, and the subclasses, the differently coloured cars. The child is still influenced by what it sees. It's easier to perceive blue cars than perceive all cars. However, you may want to argue, as many others have, that the question in these, what we call class inclusion tasks, is too difficult to understand. We'll come back to this later. Another feature of this pre-operational stage is when children refer to inanimate objects as if they're really animate or alive. Piaget calls this animism. Thus all kinds of objects have emotions, motives, intentions, thoughts, desires attributed to them wholesale. I expect most of us as children used our teddy bear as a scapegoat for our bad behaviour. This can be seen as a product of egocentrism, as the child imagines everything, and especially everyone, to be like itself.
It doesn't feel like it. He's sick, so you have to give him some medicine.
Conservation is probably the most widely investigated area of the pre-operational child's thinking. By conservation, Piaget means the ability to understand that something remains the same even though it has been transformed in appearance. A classic example is that of a glass of water remaining the same quantity when poured from a short fat glass into a tall thin glass. A pre-operational child is likely to focus on the height of the water in the tall thin glass and is likely to judge that there is now more water because the level's higher than in the shorter glass.
Now then, have they still got the same amount of squashing, or has one got more than the other?
That one's got more than
That one's got more in, right. So if I had that one and you had that one, it wouldn't be fair, because I'd have more. Right, very good, okay.
This false judgment is likely in spite of the child actually seeing the transformation taking place, that is, seeing the water being poured, or even if you allow them to pour it themselves. It occurs because the child's lack of reversibility, that is, they're unable to hold all the features of the situation in their heads, and they can't think about them being reversed. But logic does triumph over appearance eventually.
Very
Yes.
good, but they've still got the same now.
Yes.
Why have they still got the same?
Because you poured, because you swapped glasses, but you poured all that in. But it's not the same, because that one is wider than that one.
Very
So that
good.
one goes higher.
Very good. Yeah, you're really very good at that, Tim. Well done. Thank you very much. You're very...
To summarise the key features of the pre-operational stage.
The child tends to be egocentric, that is, they see the world from their own viewpoint. They also have problems with classification and tend to centre on one feature at the expense of others. They tend to attribute human feelings to inanimate objects. And, according to Piaget, they are as yet unable to conserve.
I started hallucinating. Not knowing I was hallucinating, I was seeing things which weren't actually there, and hearing sounds and voices which weren't actually there. It sounded normal. It sounded like somebody was in the next room talking to me. And somehow they had installed microphones in my ears or something like that. And I thought that the government had developed a big plot about me. And it started giving me very terrible headaches. I had some machines to give me terrible headaches. They were trying to kill me and poison me.
Schizophrenia is the most serious of all the mental disorders and results in lifelong disability for as many as 2 or 2.5 million Americans. Schizophrenia is commoner than most people realize, affecting about 1 to 2% of the population worldwide. And thus it is more common than Alzheimer's disease, multiple sclerosis, cystic fibrosis, or even insulin-dependent diabetes.
Within the human brain are millions of nerve cells called neurons. Each neuron is a cell with long arms reaching out to nearby neurons. When a neuron is activated by any typical brain function, the information is sent down the arms of the neuron by an electrical signal. When the signal reaches the end of the neuron, brain chemicals called neurotransmitters are released. These chemicals take the message to the next neuron. Then another charge is triggered to carry the message to the next neuron. To date, scientists have discovered dozens of these neurotransmitters, but one in particular is of special interest to scientists studying schizophrenia. It is called dopamine, and scientists suspect that the amount of dopamine released is related to the symptoms of schizophrenia. Many drugs that relieve these symptoms are designed to alter the action of dopamine. With Melvin Short, as with other people with schizophrenia, too little dopamine may trigger the more subtle symptoms of the disease.
I have a short-term memory loss, plus I'm tired all the time. And so I'm unable to do much work around the house.
The search for more evidence that too little dopamine can trigger the subtle symptoms of schizophrenia is pursued by Dr. Jonathan Cohen, Assistant Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Pittsburgh and Assistant Professor of Psychology at Carnegie Mellon University. Dr. Cohen and his colleagues administer a computerized memory test to 2 groups of subjects, those with and those without schizophrenia. People without the disease have few problems with this test, but subjects with schizophrenia have more difficulty because the test requires focused concentration and strong short-term memory capabilities.
Difficulty in this kind of memory ability, of course, is going to lead to disruptions in the ability to do ordinary things like have a conversation, the kinds of disruptions, for example, that we observe in schizophrenia.
The latest breakthrough in examining the brain is called positron emission tomography, PET scanning. This technique enables research scientists to actually study a person's brain while it's functioning. For the first time, scientists can see a living brain at work, in this case using the same memory test given by Dr. Cohen. The images confirm that the prefrontal cortex does not work properly in people with schizophrenia, perhaps because of changes in dopamine levels. Director of PET at the University of Pittsburgh Biomedical Center is Dr. Mark Minton.
The excitement of PET is that this really opens a whole new door at being able to look at the living, working brain and being able to look at biochemical abnormalities, physiologic abnormalities that very likely are associated with or maybe are the cause of different psychiatric diseases.
Through the use of PET scanning and other techniques, scientists have recently made still more discoveries about the neurotransmitter called dopamine and its connection to schizophrenia. They believe that just as too little dopamine in some parts of the brain can trigger the more subtle symptoms of the disease, too much dopamine in other parts can trigger the more extreme symptoms, such as hallucinations. Fortunately for people with schizophrenia, such as Melvin Short, scientists have found that drugs can decrease dopamine and thereby reduce some of the more extreme symptoms. In Melvin's case, drugs have been an invaluable part of his treatment.
For treatment, I receive a shot once every 3 weeks. It's called Prolixin. The voice is quieted down to a murmur so that I wasn't plagued by them constantly telling me that they were going to kill me.
Tragically, for people afflicted with schizophrenia, even the normal activities of everyday life can be extremely stressful, and scientists have proven that too much stress increases the flow of dopamine in the brain. For Melvin, this means that the simple tasks of life, such as caring for his children or running errands, can be stressful enough to worsen his symptoms. That is why, in addition to drugs, the other component of Melvin's treatment is regular individual and